Welcome. Join me today as we discuss the third period of Bible history known as the Patriarchal Period. Today we're going to be talking about the Patriarchal Period of Bible history. This is the third period of history that we've discussed so far. But before we start, I want to remind you about something we talked about in the last episode, or the last lesson, and that is the difference between the three dispensations and these 15 periods of Bible history. You remember that there are three dispensations that we see in the Bible. And dispensation just means an organization or a system. And so really those are three systems of worship. And the first one is the patriarchal system. And you remember that patriarchal means father-led. And the next dispensation is the Mosaical dispensation. And that just refers to the Mosaical law. And that was the system of worship following the law of Moses. And then the last or third dispensation is the Christian dispensation, which it just means that now we have the Christian system of worship that we read about in the New Testament. And I'm saying that because I don't want you to be confused, because the third period of Bible history, the third of the 15 that we will be discussing in our lessons, happens to be called the Patriarchal Period of Bible history. It's commonly referred to that because it is a time of history where we read about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, who are commonly called the patriarchs of the faith, the fathers of the faith. So I just wanted to make sure we're all understanding that there's a reason that this is, I didn't want it to be confusing that this is called the Patriarchal Period when we also have mentioned the Patriarchal Dispensation. I explained it last time, like these periods of Bible history, each will fall into one of those three dispensations. Right now, all we've talked about are things that have happened in the Patriarchal dispensation. And so this one is specifically called the Patriarchal Period of history because of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob that we'll be talking about today. And so in the Bible, we can read about this patriarchal period of history in Genesis chapter 11, starts at verse 27, and it goes through Genesis 46, verse 7. This period of history takes about 250 years. Now, I think it's interesting. So far, we've studied through events in the Bible up to chapter 11, and that covers 2,000 years. The next 35 chapters that we'll be discussing today, that's 35 chapters. It only takes about 250 years for those things to take place, for those events to take place. Now, what that means is that the narrative of the Bible, the story of the Bible, it slows way down, and it becomes so much more detailed as we read through those chapters, as the details become much more clear. So we won't be able to discuss every detail of this period. There's just too many of them, and that's not the point of our study. Remember, we're taking an overview approach. So we're looking at the big chronological picture of the Bible, and especially focusing on those things that have to do with the scheme of redemption or the plan of redemption and those events that, play a big part into that. Now, this period of history is so important because it's such a catalyst for things that we read about, people we read about, places we read about throughout the rest of the Bible. So it's so important to study. So we're going to focus today on some of these events in this period that kind of move forward the narrative of the Bible, lead us to a bigger understanding of God's plan. We're going to see his promises, the providence, and the prophecy that comes through this period of Bible history today. So this period of history begins with the calling of Abraham. Except at first, he's called Abram. That's his name when we first read about him. And he's married to Sarai, and they live in the city of Ur. It's a very pagan city. And it's while they're living in Ur that we learn that Abraham is told to go to a land that God will show him. Now, at the end of chapter 11, it just talks about his family, his father, Terah, and their family living in Ur, but it's in the book of Acts, and Stephen's preaching a sermon where he says that it is in Ur where God makes the promise or tells him he will show Abram a land. And so I think it's safe to say that at the way God showed him the land was that his father Terah wanted to move, and they moved to Haran. Well, then Terah dies, and it's while they're in Haran that God makes a specific promise to Abram to bring about a nation through him. So I think it's important to think about a nation and the things that make up a nation. A nation has three elements that it has to have. One is a people, another is a law, and the third is a land. And so it's important as we study through these next 2 or 3 periods of history, we're going to find out how God makes each aspect of that promise come to fulfillment through Abraham and his people. And so Abram's promised a land that God's going to give to his offspring or children. And so that means he's going to have descendants. And it indicates, of course, that there's going to be a child, at least one, that Abram would have. But there's a problem. His wife, Sarah, is barren. She's not been able to have any children. And so this is during this period, during this time, is when we read about how Abram and Sarah scandalously try to circumvent God's plan so that Abram can have that offspring. And they even go so far as to try to have Abram have a child with another woman, Hagar, and he does. But then even through all of that, God says and clarifies that it is through Sarah that the son of promise will come. And so that's where we are reading about Abram and Sarai given new names. I think it's interesting to think about Sarai. It means princess, but then when her name is changed to Sarah, that means a princess of multitudes. And Abram means exalted father, but Abraham has the meaning more of father of many or father of multitudes. So even in the changing of their names, God is reminding them that he will fulfill the promise, that they can trust him, that he will fulfill the promise to make them have a nation through their offspring. So God fulfills his promise to Abraham and Sarah through the birth of Isaac. He's very often referred to as the son of promise. And in Genesis chapter 26, verse 4, we can read about God's promise being renewed through Isaac or to Isaac. He's promised offspring and a seed by which all nations will be blessed. And then later, his son, Jacob, is made the same promise. It's important to remember that this is one promise to Abraham and his son Isaac and then his son Jacob. It's one promise that each generation is being renewed, the promise by God. And the offspring, we can read in Galatians chapter 3 verse 16, is referring to Jesus. And that's how, he could say that by your nation all the nations will be blessed. So he's not even just promising them a nation. It's that this nation that they're going to father is going to bless all nations. And then again in Galatians 3:16, we can read that is because Jesus comes through this family line, if you follow the genealogies in the Bible. Now, at this time, Jacob's name is changed to Israel. And this is very important because, we read about the Israelites. And the Israelites, that just refers to Jacob's family. He had 12 sons, and each of those sons grow up and, have families, and those become known as the tribes of Israel. So there's 12 tribes of Israel. And so this promise that God made Abraham, it was renewed to Isaac, renewed to Jacob, And it's very important because it's through these tribes, through Israel, Jacob's new name, that these nation will rise up, and all of the nations will be blessed. So Jacob had 12 sons, and the next to last son was Joseph. Now, the story of Joseph is a beautiful one of God's promise and God's providence. So at the time, the family is living in the land of Canaan, and the brothers hate Joseph. He's his father's favorite, and they just grow to hate him. And you may remember that they hate him so much that they end up selling him as a slave to people who are traveling down to Egypt. They let their father Jacob think that Joseph has just been killed by an animal. They take his coat, the coat of many colors, and they cover it with some blood, and they just hand it to their father, and he just thinks the worst, and they let him think it. So for years, Joseph is presumed dead by his father, but but down in Egypt, he is put in the house of a man named Potiphar, and he's a servant, and Joseph is successful. He's a trusted servant, but because Potiphar's wife lies about the nature of their relationship, he's put into prison, and he's there 3 years. And in that time, he comes to interpret some dreams, and eventually interprets a couple of dreams that Pharaoh of Egypt himself had dreamt. And it was about a famine coming. And Joseph interprets the dream. And since he makes the suggestion that he thinks Pharaoh should stock up on the grain from these good years. Read about the dream that Pharaoh had, but he's wanting him to stock up on the grain so that they have plenty for the years of the famine. And because he seems to have a good plan, Pharaoh puts Joseph in charge. And Joseph, this person sold into slavery by his hateful brothers, becomes second in command in Egypt, and that's pretty lofty right there, and it shows God's providence about taking something bad and making it be good later on. And so during this famine, Jacob in Canaan, they're suffering too. It's a famine that's throughout this larger region, and he sends the sons, Joseph's brothers, down to Egypt to buy the grain. They never expect to see Joseph, and they just meet with a man who's in charge, and Joseph recognizes them. They don't recognize him. And so after a funny chain of events with Joseph trying to he wants to see the baby brother who didn't come with them. And so there's a funny chain of events that happen, but eventually he makes himself known, and he convinces the brothers to go back to their father Jacob, to bring Jacob back down into Egypt to where they will be safe and taken care of. And Jacob decides to go. Of course, he's very happy that he finds out his son Joseph is still alive. And on the way, God promises him that down in Egypt, that their family will be blessed and grow into a great nation in Egypt. And so they live in Egypt, in the land of Goshen, and it's a good land for their herds and their flocks. And of course, after some time, Jacob is older and he dies. Then the brothers are scared that Joseph is going to turn on them now. And one of the most beautiful passages is when Joseph tells them that that they meant this for harm for him, but God meant it for good, to preserve a nation. And so, of course, he's talking about their family. Their whole family was preserved because Joseph was in Egypt. And so he tells them to not be sorry, that he knows God worked this plan and that they don't have to worry about him being mad. And so it's in Egypt that first aspect of the promise that God made to Abraham several years before is coming to place, that there will be a people that he will be a father to, a great people. And so that is where we are ending this patriarchal period as far as the nation of Israel and following them. Now I want to mention that and remind us that the Bible, again, is not written chronologically. And an example of this is that the book of Job is thought by many Bible scholars to have taken place in the time of the patriarchal period of history. So it's according to our pages in our Bible, it's farther back, but we could take Job and we could put that book into this time period. Most people think that at latest he was a contemporary of Abraham, or and during that time period at the latest. Most people think he came after the flood, and so I just wanted to remind you that even though Job comes later, it's still during this period of history. And it also leads us to something that's going to become important here in a couple of weeks or a couple of lessons later, where Job is not an Israelite, but he is also still a faithful person to God. He's worshiping God. He is a faithful man and good. If you read the very first chapter of Job, you can read about how God talks about what a good person he was. He was worshiping and faithful to God, leading his family. And so it's just an example that we're going to mention later, that this time period, or this family, of Israel, is going to be the way Jesus comes into the world. And that's why they're called the chosen people. They're chosen because it's through their family that Jesus will eventually come. But that does not mean, and we'll have an example of this in a couple more lessons, but that there are other people who are faithful serving God. And so there'll be an interesting chart, I think, that I'm going to try to show you later. But I just want you to tuck this away and remember that here's Job during the same time period, faithfully serving God, going through trials and overcoming and enduring the troubles. And so that's a beautiful story by itself. So maybe study through that period, but understand it's going through this, happening during this time period. Thank you for joining me today. I hope you're benefiting from these. Check out the worksheet, print it off or download it. Check out the links. There's going to be a timeline that sort of a timeline that helps us keep track of the events of Abraham's life and Jacob and Isaac and Joseph, or Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. I said that wrong. But check that out, and hopefully you will gain from this. Please share these lessons. Even if you're watching on YouTube, like them and subscribe. It really helps them stay visible. And if you're watching through Instagram, please give me a like and share. It just helps things be more visible to people so that they might come across it, even it just shows up on their feed. So please do that for me. Join me next time. We'll be studying about the time of period during the time in Egypt.